Thank you, and thank you so much for the introduction, Claudia, and for the invitation to be here. It's really lovely to be here now. We had a really lovely morning with some of the staff and PhD students and master's students. Really great seminar discussion this morning, which I really enjoyed. And I'm looking forward to this lecture. Thank you very much for locating me. I wanted to actually start with a few more words about myself. Forgive the self-indulgence, but I wanted to begin the lecture with a few words to locate myself, because I think it's relevant for what I want to focus on this afternoon. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, it's good. Okay, good, great. So I was trained as a cultural geographer a long time ago now, and that interest, I think, in the geographies of culture has been something that's been a continuous thread through my work. So, for example, my first book was an engagement with the spatial politics of culture, as well as landscape and environmental aesthetics in Sri Lanka, which is a place with which I've nurtured a long-term relationship in my work. And this interest in Sri Lanka, I think, means I've also been particularly drawn to South Asian studies. As Claudia said, together with a colleague from the history department at UCL, around 10 years ago we started a South Asian Studies Research Centre at UCL. That's a centre for the study of South Asia and the Indian Ocean world at UCL. And really this was a way of trying to bring together South Asianists based across the many different departments at UCL, we didn't really have a centre in which to congregate and talk to one another. My work has also pushed a conversation, I think, between post-colonial theory or post-colonial studies and geography. In part, this is because of Sri Lanka's colonial history, of course, but it's also, I think, been central to reckoning with my own history, being a second-generation South Asian, born in London, the child of post-colonial immigrants. And broadly speaking, I think that particular confluence of interests and training between cultural geography, South Asian studies and post-colonialism means that intellectually I think I've always located myself in quite broad interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, I should say, ways. So for example, the book I'm currently writing is actually a spatial history of British Asian dance music, right? Particular mode of cultural production, and it's a book that I guess I would want to situate in that broad multidisciplinary field of cultural studies. So the reason I mention all of this is really, at the outset, is really to stress that I've never really considered myself an urban studies scholar, right? Not even an urban geographer, actually. Been pulled, I think, into certain conversations within urban studies, and I've written and published in a few urban studies journals, but my work, I think, has always been characterised by, I guess, what I would call a certain kind of indifference to the urban. Excuse me. By indifference, I guess I don't mean to suggest that I think the city or urban life are in any ways unimportant or irrelevant to the things in which I'm interested, and importantly their politics. On the contrary, actually. So for example, in the book I just mentioned, the one I'm currently writing, the city becomes hugely important with respect to the history of British Asian dance music and its emergence, insofar as I'm interested in the club and nightlife spaces in East and North London in the early to mid 1990s, where this form of culture, the scene, if you like, emerged and subsequently proliferated. Rather, I think what I mean by an indifference to the city and an indifference to the urban is a certain sense that the city and the urban have never been really, for me, the primary foci of the things that I'm interested in and their politics. They're inevitably part of the spatial dynamics that my work has sought to tease out, but never the main object of analysis. So in other words, the urban and urban studies have never been the ground from which I speak. So I guess I'm saying all this because one dimension of the elsewhere from which this lecture speaks. Excuse me. That is to say, the elsewhere to which my title this afternoon gestures is a disciplinary elsewhere, right? Or disciplinary elsewheres, I should say. So in other words, I want to approach the city as a cultural and post-colonial geographer, not necessarily as an urban geographer or an urban studies scholar. And what I want to suggest or argue in this talk is that doing so offers, I think, perhaps some useful ways of moving towards spatial difference in global south contexts with respect to that phrase that this module actually broadly grapples with, global south urbanisms, right? And in fact, I guess I want to suggest that it's precisely a kind of methodological indifference to the urban that opens us towards, or rather that has the potential to open us towards spatial and social formations in global south contexts that sit somewhere between spatial categories like the city and the non-city, or the urban and the rural, and their rather binary implications, right? And what I want to do then in this lecture is first elaborate on this methodological argument before second pointing to some work that I think firstly, I guess, usefully shows us exactly what the politico-intellectual potentials are of approaching global south urbanism with this and through this kind of indifference to the urban. And then secondly, to talk a little bit about what difference it might make to approach the city as text, right? So, in a sense then, I guess the question that sits at the heart of this lecture is a classically urban question in some senses, right? What is the city? Or rather, what is the city across the global south? And I guess I want to suggest that as researchers, methodologically speaking, being able to grapple with global south urbanisms perhaps depends on us considering that cities across global south contexts may not in fact be cities at all. So in other words, to bring these spatial formations and geographical imaginations into representation on their own terms, perhaps we need to open ourselves to forms of difference, forms of spatial difference situated beyond that which the city can name, right? The city in inverted commas here. And this is an argument that's based actually on a short commentary piece that came out in IJA, the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, in 2021 now. And this was a commentary piece that was part of a special issue edited by Natalie Oswin and Geraldine Pratt. The special issue was called Critical Urban Theory in the Urban Age. But of course, that refrain, the city as text, is not my own phrase, right? I'm not going to take credit for that. And just out of interest, I generally sort of hate interactive lectures, but I just want to sort of get a sense here, just get a sense check of whether people are aware of or remember where that phrase comes from, the city as text. Anyone? No? Okay, so it's a phrase I've taken, it's the title of a 1990 book by the cultural geographer Jim Duncan, who was actually my PhD, one of my PhD examiners. And that book was, so Jim Duncan was part of the I guess the sort of the cultural turn in the 1980s in human geography and cultural geography, one of the sort of progenitors, if you like, of the new cultural geography. And that book, The City as Text, on the left of your screen there, was his attempt to engage with the symbology, I guess the sacred Buddhist iconography of the royal city of Kandy in central Sri Lanka. So it was a book, as I said, that was centrally placed within geography's cultural turn in that late 1980s, early 1990s period. And this was a moment, I guess, when geographers like Jim Duncan, but also Dennis Cosgrove, Stephen Daniels, Mona Demosh and others, began to make an argument about the importance of representation to the production of landscape meaning. So famously, in the introduction to their 1988 edited volume, The Iconography of Landscape, which is the book on the right-hand side of the screen there, Dennis Cosgrave and Stephen Daniels, they argued that, and I'm just going to read the line on the bottom of the page. This is the very first sentence in the book, actually, but they argue that a landscape as a cultural image, a pictorial way of representing, structuring, or symbolising surroundings. By which they meant, of course, that any landscape's meanings are produced by the dominant stories we tell ourselves about that landscape. And Jim Duncan's book on Kandy was an attempt to set that way of approaching landscape to work by showing how the city of Kandy and its meanings, or rather the city of Kandy's meanings, have iconographically and representationally been produced by architecture, by landscape design, by sanctioned landscape histories, as well as rituals, practices, forms of pageantry, so on and so forth. So the sort of echo of that refrain in my lecture today is a gesture to this earlier body of work in cultural geography, an attempt really to bring it to bear on the city, this notion of the city, when we conceive the city not as a sort of natural and universal spatial object in any sense, but instead as a humanly and ideologically created spatial category that has an umbilical and codependent relationship with urban studies. And the methodological argument of this lecture then is very much inspired by what I want to characterise and what I think we have all come to know as a significant body of post-colonial urban studies scholarship that I imagine is probably well known to many of us in this room. And I'm just going to spend a few moments sort of going through that post-colonial urban studies scholarship. And apologies for the sort of the next few slides are maybe a little text heavy, but there are pictures to come, don't worry. So in recent years, I guess what I'm talking about here is scholarship that in recent years, urban scholarship that in recent years has been inspired by post-colonialism and has generated a valuable body of work that has usefully and no less urgently interrogated urban studies universalising characterisations of cities the world over. So this post-colonial urban studies scholarship has been insistent that cities, small and large in the global south, as well as a globally diverse range of urban experiences and urbanisation processes, be analysed on their own terms. That is to say, without recourse to Euro-American urban master narratives. The argument is that southern cities can't simply be seen as empirical variation on a universally applicable narrative regarding what the city, the urban and urbanisation are. And the critical point I think that many of us here will likely be at least vaguely familiar with is that historically the majority of urban theory has been generated by studies of a few key paradigmatic cities: Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, New York, London, Paris, for example. Right? So scholars like my colleague at UCL, Jenny Robinson, and also my good friend and colleague Colin McFarlane at Durham University have so effectively argued, this has given rise to what Robert Beauregard referred to back in 2003 as a kind of academic boosterism, wherein a few key superlative cities come to represent, and this is to quote him now, both the future of all other urban places and of urban theory. Now, in developing this argument, this post-colonial urban studies scholarship has encouraged us to interrogate the implicit comparisons at work in urban research, to unmask the ways that theory culture in urban studies has mobilised particular concepts and epistemic regularities that taxonomise urban life. So the argument is that urban concepts like alienation, like urban anomy, like property, like regeneration, city centre, suburb even, these are terms that work as abstractions, right, enjoining urban researchers to find these conceptual paradigms in the cities on which they work, often at the cost of trying to read on their own terms the different kinds of phenomena that occur in those cities. So riffing off Dipesh Chakrabarty's book, Provincialising Europe, which was a hugely influential text for much of this work, the conceptual injunction for a distinctively post-colonial urban studies then has been to provincialise urban modernity. This is something we spoke about in the seminar this morning. And in so doing, develop an urban studies attendant to historical difference in globally diverse contexts. So southern cities understood this way on their own terms offer back to the corpus of an historically Eurocentric urban theory what Jenny Robinson has referred to as a kind of conceptual revisability, full with the potential to build a more cosmopolitan urban studies. Now, this post-colonial urban studies scholarship and the context in which it's emerged will be, as I said, maybe familiar to some of us in this room. And indeed, my own argument today, my own comments are inspired by the thrust of this post-colonially inflected urban studies, but I think they also depart from it in one key respect, because as Colin McFarlane usefully suggests in his 2010 article, The Comparative City, the city itself can also be considered an abstraction. And it's this point that I really want to tease out through the rest of this lecture. Right? The city itself is an abstraction, which is to say that the very concept of the city is an abstract spatial category that we mobilise to repeat across planetary space. Now, the implications of this point for what I want to suggest is a more sustained post-colonial literary theoretical critique of urban studies, so moving from a post-colonial urban studies to a post-colonial critique of urban studies. The implications of this, I think, are profound, right, if not properly worked through as yet. And it's the development of such a critique that is the methodological thrust of my argument today for approaching Global South urbanisms. And as I've said, note that move here from a post-colonial urban studies to a post-colonial critique of urban studies, which is key to the argument that I want to develop through this lecture. Because I want to suggest that McFarlane's assertion that the city itself is an abstraction should give us pause for thought regarding what the city actually is. Indeed, if it's an abstraction, and I agree that it is, it follows that as much as the city is a material and political economic reality, it's also an epistemological object. It's a form of spatial categorization that exists in language, in textuality, in representation. Now, this provocation suggests that there's some value in asking whether, by calling an abundance of spatial forms cities, do we pull them into the orbit of all those forms of socio-spatial organisation that we reference via that very term? Now, my point in posing this question is, I guess, to remind that one of post-colonial theory's imperatives, I should say, is to move toward difference by critically engaging the politics of representation, by which I mean the textual production of meaning. So, it's worth remembering here that post-colonial theory emerges in 1970s literary studies, actually, right? Not the social sciences or urban studies. So before post-colonial theory proliferates amongst the humanities and the social sciences, it was always a literary theoretical project that was concerned precisely with the textual production of meaning. Above all, as I've said, the politics of representation. So thinking of Edward Said's foundational text, Orientalism, becomes instructive here, because that book was essentially about the discursive production of the geographical imagination, or, as Said called it, imaginative geographies. So from this perspective, I think one answer to the question, what is the post-colonial city, or indeed, paraphrasing the title of Jenny Robinson's 2000 book, The Ordinary City, what is an ordinary city? So one answer to this question is that it might in fact not be a city at all, right? The question is, what forms of spatial organisation and geographical imagination lay beyond that which the city names? So to be clear, these questions, and I guess the speculative answers that I offer, these are meant as heuristic devices for moving toward spatial difference. They're devices for beginning to try to understand spaces on their own terms, on terms true to the singularity of their differences. In her excellent article in IJA, Who's Afraid of Postcolonial Theory, Ananya Roy has pushed the potential of this kind of interrogation by suggesting that postcolonial theory poses an epistemological problem for urban studies, insofar as it poses the thorny problem of how to narrate the spatial stories of the non-West without recourse to the master narratives produced by the West about the non-West. And drawing on the literary theorist Amir Mufti's critique of what he refers to as global comparativism, it's actually a really brilliant paper that I recommend people reading if they're interested. I think it was published in Critical Inquiry, and it's from around 2005. It's simply called Global Comparativism. But drawing on Mufti's argument there, Roy's point is that the very language and grammar of urban studies is Eurocentric, right? And the problem of Eurocentrism is that we're all Eurocentric now, right? We can't get away from that. Can't step outside Eurocentrism. And this cuts, I think, to the very core of postcolonial literary theory, because it names a problem which is about the textuality of theory, including urban theory. It's a problem of how we bring into representation forms of spatial difference that can't quite be described by the concept metaphors and theoretical resources that we routinely deploy in our accepted taxonomizations of space. So this, I want to suggest, is the problem of post-colonial difference. Now, as I've written elsewhere, this is also a problem of geographical subalternity. To be more precise, this is the very problem revealed by Gayatri Spivak's literary theoretical critique of the Subaltern Studies Collective's work in her famous, or should I say infamous, essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, which was published back in 1988 originally. So at stake for Spivak in this essay was the categorization of the subaltern as subaltern via the Subaltern Studies Collective's early scholarship. So the categorization of the subaltern as the subaltern, right? Which she argued couldn't help but reproduce a kind of colonial logic of othering, of categorization, right? These subaltern figures that can't come into representation on their own terms are now categorized as subaltern. Right? So they fall into a category. And she argued in that essay that when the subaltern is spoken for by the bourgeois diasporic Indian intellectual and authoritatively referred to as a subaltern, that figure emerges as what she refers to as a pre-scripted identity indifference. In other words, the subaltern is spoken for by the agency of the well-meaning theorist in ways that preclude the subaltern coming into representation on her own terms. Now this then perpetuates a kind of taxonomization, a categorization that may actually have little to do with the subject's own sense of itself or self-identity. And elsewhere I've suggested that Spivak's critique of subalternity should give geographers pause for thought about the ideological effects of dominant forms of spatial theory as modes of signification. So the point here is that our familiar spatial concepts work to representationally produce and, importantly, naturalize spatial objects in the imagination. And what I'm suggesting here really is that in the context of urban studies, the city is one such epistemological object, right? It's an abstraction, in Colin McFarlane's words. What then are the implications of this methodological approach? And I realise that thus far this has been a little abstract actually, so I want to try and pin some of this down a little bit by talking through some work actually, right? And in the time left I want to talk through two implications of this broadly speaking, this sort of methodological approach of being indifferent to the urban. So it's two implications for working on global South urbanisms. And the first really concerns analytical efforts to look beyond cityness for radically other spatial formations and geographies, or geographical imaginations, right? Those which are perhaps dissimulated, an awkward word, meaning really concealed, right? Spatial formations that are concealed by the very conceptual stickiness of this notion of the city as a spatial category that we all take for granted. And I want to lightly refer to some recent scholarship that I think shows the potential of this kind of indifference to the city that I've been talking about for getting to grips with global South urbanisms. And then the second implication of this approach is that just like the cultural turn in landscape geography that I talked about earlier, that showed landscapes to be cultural images or ways of seeing, I want to suggest that if we work with the premise that the city is also, in some senses, a textual refrain, a spatial category, an abstraction, we can also point to the ways that cityness conceived like this is mobilised and deployed in global South contexts to enable forms of dispossession in various regional and spatial contexts. And to make that point, I'm going to draw a little more squarely on some research I did a while back at a place called Auroville, which is a settlement near Pondicherry in southern India. Sorry, I probably should have been on that slide just a minute ago, but that's okay. Anyway, so as I've tried to stress thus far, the work of a post-colonial theoretical critique of urban studies is to open up the very possibility that the city may well be a spatial concept that in fact conceals radically different forms of socio-spatial organisation in post-colonial contexts. And Gayatri Spivak poses just such a provocation in an article that's now a good quarter of a century old. It's 25 years old, right? It's an article that focuses on Bangalore, but also dances around Calcutta and New York, as well as India's 3 other megacity projects, so Bombay, Hyderabad and Madras. And the essay is entitled Megacity, but importantly, megacity with a sort of struck-through font. And her use of the struck-through font means to indicate that each of these cities are historically, empirically, economically incomparable with the theoretical abstraction of the term megacity. Yet each at the same time is somehow also caught by the conceptual grab that the term megacity offers for immediate comprehension. So, indeed, gesturing to India's megacity programme, which was announced in 1993 as the first major urban policy initiative following India's economic liberalisation in 1991, Spivak writes how the only common requirement handed down to the 5 identified cities, which were Bangalore, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Chennai and Kolkata, as I've said, the only common requirement that was handed down by central government was that 50% of investment be sought from overseas. Right? So in every other respect, each of these cities is what she refers to as the sedimentation of its own historical text, a geographical moment in the larger unit spatially defined as India. They're all singular, in other words, right? And thus entirely different from one another, which makes the noun megacity radically unstable in its ability, radically, what's the word I'm looking for? Ineffective, lacking in its ability to hold the historical difference that makes Calcutta, Calcutta, Mumbai, Mumbai, Bangalore, Bangalore, and so on, right? Now, the methodological point that I want to take from this is that the post-colonial city thought this way takes us elsewhere. It enjoins us to learn new forms of social and spatial organisation that may only be partially and inadequately translated as cityness, whereas Post-colonial urban studies adheres to the city and the urban as terrains of debate, just as it provincialises understandings of city life and urban experience. I guess what I'm saying is that a post-colonial critique of urban studies instead moves toward different terrains not corralled by the abstractions of the city. It moves towards forms of spatial difference, variety, and radically different lives for which we might not yet have the language. Now, this is, I guess, a difficult task to comprehend precisely because it invites creative forms of would-be urban learning about domains hitherto untheorised or unthought. It's in fact a kind of learning, I guess, guided by an ethical imperative to unlearn that which we already know. Such unlearning is what precipitates the kind of epistemic violence that makes room for spatial difference. It moves toward what Colin McFarlane refers to as a rupture of the episteme of the Euro-American Academy. And it's the close reading of spatial formations on their own terms, what Spivak would call doing your homework, right? That holds open, I think, the possibility of placing the very notion of a city's cityness under interdiction or under erasure, revealing quite other forms of spatial organisation or geographical imagination. Now, the kind of epistemic rupture to which I'm gesturing is not unprecedented in recent years in and across geography and urban studies. And here I just briefly want to sketch the outlines of three more really fantastic examples, I think, of the kind of research on global south urbanisms that are, I think, actually doing this. They're methodologically guided by the kind of indifference to the city that I've thus far in this talk been gesturing towards. And the first and maybe most well known of which is the literature on desiccator spaces, or desiccator urbanism as it's sometimes called, which emerges in the 1990s as an attempt really to identify and bring into representation extended metropolitan regions in Southeast Asia, around Jakarta initially with Terry McGee's work. And that term desiccator was coined, I think, initially by the urban geographer Terry McGee, following his fieldwork in the Jakarta mega-urban region and his conversations with Indonesian colleagues about what that fieldwork revealed. As he writes in a short entry in the International Encyclopedia of Human Geography, the term desiccator is a neologism coined to recognise the fact that rural areas adjacent to the built-up central areas of cities were being subject to increasing urban expansion. The process, he suggests, was creating areas of mixed urban and rural activity that were increasing in territorial size and population. And the term desiccator combined two words from the Indonesian language, so desa meaning village and kota meaning town, in a way that sought to capture the confluence of rurality and urbanity that existed in Indonesia for many centuries. He goes on in that short entry to stress how, and I'll just read the quote that's on the screen here. Apologies, gosh, it's a lot of text, isn't it? Sorry. These developments, he writes, are reshaping the urban space of the mega-urban regions for which the models of the organisation of urban space that have been developed in the past for developed countries are no longer valid. Right? They're replaced by the concept of mixed urban land uses in a form of hybridity that reflects the collapse of space and time, in which these extended urban spaces are linked by networks of flows of commodities, people, capital, information that facilitate urban expansion. Today, these desiccator regions are a kind of in-between in the rural-urban dichotomy that have become a prevailing form of land use. And what I read him to be emphasising here is the sheer inadequacy of extant theoretical abstractions like the city to be able to capture or bring this socio-spatial phenomenon into representation on its own terms. Desiccator is the term that he and his colleagues developed to bring into representation the patterns of sprawl, extended spatial agglomeration, agricultural land use, and high population density, for which a conceptual language did not heretofore exist. Now, the second example that I wanted to talk about is Professor Tran's fabulous recent article, which I really enjoyed reading. And it's a really thought-provoking, I think, and excellent article, which was published in the journal Southeast Asia Research, right? Entitled Beyond Dualistic Categories, Interstitial Perspectives and Practices in Peri-Urban Hanoi. And it's a largely, I guess, ethnographic piece on one particular street. And if I can, Professor Tran, if you can help me with the pronunciation of the street. Okay, brilliant. Wonton Street. In peri-urban Hanoi, a street which bisects a residential gated community to the north and the more rural environ of Xuan Dinh village to the south of the street. And the article frames this particular street as an interstitial geography in a number of different ways, interstitial in a number of different ways, right? It positions the street as a place that straddles the developmental promise of new urban lifestyles of the city as a promise, if you like, on the one hand, and on the other, a Vietnamese village way of life replete with a variety of informal businesses, so on and so forth, right? So this is a street that's positioned between the traditional and the modern, street that's also caught in a kind of suspended temporality between its current informal morphology as an informally developed but well-established 1.5 kilometre dirt track, barely 5 to 7 metres wide in some parts. Caught between this and the state's plan to develop it to a 64 metre wide 4-lane road. These plans which have haunted the street since 2009, but as I understand it, show no signs of actually happening, right? And as Professor Tran writes, all of these sort of interstitial conditions and practices combine to produce a new category of space, right? Which, to read the quote again, defies the dualistic categories of urban versus rural, modern versus traditional, permanent versus temporary, and brings into light the otherwise invisible population of workers and small entrepreneurs that belong neither to the village nor to the Siputra, the settlement to the north. And I hope I haven't butchered your article, but I really enjoyed reading that, so thank you very much for that piece of work. And the final example I wanted to mention was moving from Southeast and East Asia across the Indian Ocean to Tanzania. And I want to briefly mention Claire Mercer's work and her recent work on what she refers to as Dar es Salaam's suburban frontier. And in both an article in Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers, published in 2017, and her monograph, which was published just last year, called The Suburban Frontier, Claire Mercer develops the notion of the suburban frontier to name a geography on the peripheries of Dar es Salaam where the auto-construction of middle-class houses is key to the production of middle-class lifestyles, and thus an emerging post-colonial African middle class. And what her ethnographic research over a long period of time reveals is a socio-spatial dialectic of sorts, wherein middle-class Africans are shaping distinctive suburban landscapes that in turn are shaping an emergent Tanzanian middle class. So this growth at Dar es Salaam's fringes cannot, she suggests, just be characterised as urban overspill. And in her earlier article, the 2017 article, she argues that these suburban growth patterns are driven by a relatively affluent middle class whose spatial orientation is toward their rural ancestral origins. Right? And in the book, more recently, she argues that the suburban frontier is an appropriate metaphor, an appropriate term for these peripheral geographical imaginations, because it captures that sense of these new urban forms that, again, defy easy categorization, wherein extant work on urban expansion in the global south seems, to her analytic, inadequate to the task of fully capturing what's going on in Dar es Salaam's urban periphery. So Mercer's work makes sense, not in the context, I guess, of an urban studies lens that would prioritise urbanisation processes. I'm thinking perhaps of the planetary urbanisation thesis here, or simply the city's, in the context of the city's rapacious growth. But Mercer's work makes sense instead in the context of, as she herself puts it, quote, a long tradition of research in African studies that demonstrates the continued significance of the rural for shaping contemporary urban African life. And I think she makes a really important point here, and one that I want to actually suggest might be common to all of the three case studies I've just mentioned, right? So to Terry McGee's work, to Professor Tran's work, and also to Claire Mercer's work, which is the importance of area studies, actually, right? The importance of area studies communities in honing methodological approaches that are attuned to the histories and particularities of the places on which we work. I think it's significant that the journal in which your article was published, Professor Tran, was an area studies journal, right? It makes an argument about a particular geography, a particular place, right, which makes sense in that context. So I think that's significant, actually. So if the Global South is to have any methodological or intellectual value as a term, I think it's maybe to remind us of the dangers of imagining that it signifies a single or common geography, right? There are any number of places and relational histories that comprise a so-called Global South, and area studies communities of practice and scholarship are, I think, one of the best ways we have in the university of getting to grips with each of those sort of intellectual communities. This is something we spoke about also in the seminar this morning. Right, let me move on now to talk about this second way of mobilising this notion of the city as text. Because thus far, I guess I've been talking about the injunction to look beyond the city, right? Conceived as a city conceived as a theoretical abstraction. So to look beyond this theoretical abstraction in putatively urban research in various Global South contexts. And I've drawn on what I think are some excellent examples of work that's what I would say is indifferent to the work that's indifferent to the city in ways that methodologically reveal radically different kinds of spatial formations. But now I guess I want to move on to what I suggested is a second way that we can usefully think about that notion of the city as text, which is to show the politics and effects of representational cityness. Because if we can think of the city in ways that bear similarities to how the new cultural geography conceptualized landscape, that is as a way of seeing, landscape as a way of seeing, as a cultural image, I think we can point to certain ways that an idea or geographical imagination of cityness becomes mobilized as a form of governance or even governmentality in particular contexts. And what interests me here are the particular kinds of developmental and teleological imaginations that cityness precipitates and the political effects that these have. Excuse me. And I've already mentioned actually Professor Tran's article in that street in peri-urban Hanoi, and the way that it points to the effects of the state's project plans with respect to the widening of the road from its current sort of 7 or 8 metre wide existence as a track to a 64 metre wide 4-lane main road. And as she writes, it's precisely this future orientated projection that's placed the street into a kind of temporal interstitiality and suspended animation, as it were, where people feel unable to auto-construct beyond a certain level because of the impending threat of impermanence, right, hanging over them. A threat that she also says has loomed over the businesses on the street since the project plans were announced back in 2009. Now, I guess what's important here in my reading is not whether or not those plans come to fruition, right? That becomes irrelevant in some senses because it's the future-oriented work of cityness imagined that becomes so powerful here as a way of getting people to behave as they ought, right? Of governmentalising them into what the state deems to be the right forms of construction here. And I want now to turn more squarely to some of my own research, as I said, on a settlement in southern India, a settlement called Auroville, which is another example of the governmental and developmental power of representational cityness conceived this way. Now, this work comes from, well, it was published again in the journal IJA a couple of years ago, but also featured in my, very briefly in my 2019 book, Post-Colonialism, and it's drawn from field and archival work conducted there back in 2012, 2013 and 2014. And apart from the peculiar and rather fascinating history of the settlement Auroville, what interested me in this project was precisely the work of a very potent geographical imagination of cityness, and particularly what happens when urban representations and claims to cityness are made in the absence of the densities, of the materialities and political economic relations typically associated with cities, right? So Auroville then is a planned community in Tamil Nadu in southern India, about 100 kilometres south of Madras, of Chennai. It dates back to 1968. It was founded in 1968 and was dubbed a spiritual city or city of tomorrow by its followers. It was conceived actually by followers of Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, the Indian nationalist and freedom fighter who fled to French-controlled Pondicherry from Calcutta in 1910 after the British issued a warrant for his arrest. Now, Ghosh retired from his political activism that same year and founded an ashram in Pondicherry and devoted himself to a spiritual life which he pursued through his own brand of integral yoga. And though he died in 1950, some 18 years before the founding of Auroville, his spiritual partner, Mira Alfassa, a French woman actually, who became known amongst their followers as the Mother. It's all very weird, Auroville, but profoundly interesting as well. But so his partner, Mira Alfassa, the Mother, founded Auroville in Ghosh's memory, and as a physical manifestation of his teachings in 1968. So she conceived it as, I'm going to read this quote here, somewhere on earth that no nation could claim as its sole property, a place where all human beings of goodwill, sincere in their aspirations, could love freely as citizens of the world, obeying one single authority, that of the supreme truth. Now, it was a project that experimented with forms of communalist socio-spatial organisation, and it was also conceived as a cosmopolitan project with spiritually inflected internationalist ambitions. Interestingly, we were having a conversation about Christiania earlier this morning, so this was founded just 3 years before Christiania in that similar kind of historical conjuncture, actually. So because of these cosmopolitan and internationalist ambitions, the project was given support by the Indian government actually at the time, who legally facilitated its materialisation in the midst of what the state deemed to be wasteland, in inverted commas, wasteland in rural Tamil Nadu. So just again to show you the location of Auroville. So the next part of this story is that a French architect and urban planner, a guy called Roger Angers, was commissioned to develop an urban master plan for Auroville. And in 1965, he revealed what he referred to as the galaxy plan, his galaxy plan for the city to come, which you can see on the left-hand image and the right-hand image. Now, the galaxy plan projected a city to come with a population of 50,000 within 30 years. Now, some 60 years later, after the first 300 international and Indian settlers came to Oroville, went to Oroville in 1968, Oroville's population is no more than 2,500. Right? In 2012, it had a population of 2,269 actually, around 40% of whom were metropolitan, middle class, mostly upper caste Indians, and the majority of the rest of the population were from Europe. Approximately 15% were French, 13% German, 7% Italian, 4% Dutch, 3 to 4% American and Russian. Now, in other words, Angers' galaxy plan has not been built. Right? The settlement is characterized by these pockets of experimental, modernist and sustainable architecture. I'm not sure how sustainable the gold leaf is in the geodesic dome there, right? But it's known for this sort of experimental, sustainable and modernist architecture, which is actually sort of distributed quite sparsely over wide areas, which are connected by a network of dirt tracks, roads, and a social infrastructure that sort of attempts to bind its residents. Now, whether or not we can legitimately call Oroville a city is besides the point, I think, right? But if cities are characterized by things like their density and concentrations of peoples and things, also by the heterogeneity of lifestyles they juxtapose in close proximity, the siting of networks of communication, flow and interconnection, both across and beyond a settlement's own spatial form. These are all qualities I take from Ash Amin and Nigel Thrift's 2002 book. I think it's called Understanding Cities. Now, if we can think about cities in these kinds of ways, right, then Oroville falls short of most of these criteria, all of these criteria actually, right? It lacks the density of people and things, right? It sociologically lacks the diversity of lifestyles. It actively also works to enclose itself as an alternative community. But, and this is the important point, the community disambiguates itself from the villages, the Tamil villages that surround it, in part precisely through the performative effect of its claim to cityness, which is what I want to emphasize here, right? And what I want to stress really is that historically, the settlers' attempts to disambiguate their settlement from a constitutive rural outside in the Tamil Nadu region has at times taken the form of a distinctly neo-colonial relationship. This is something that the historian Jessica Namakal writes brilliantly about as well, actually. And I guess my contribution to some of Jessica's work has been that the geographical imagination of cityness has, I think, been key to this. So, for example, in 1968, a sociologist called Dr. Vishwa conducted an ethnographic survey on behalf of Oroville, focusing on the local population in the regions marked out for which at that stage was still a kind of experiment, right? And his report was based on a mere 3.5 weeks of research, and I think it reveals much about the colonising intent of the Oroville project. Now, Dr. Vishwa's report refers to places earmarked for purchase and development by Oroville, using not the existing names of the villages, but instead their future Orovillian names. So, for example, the established villages of Tiruchittambalam and Mortandi become Promes, and Bombalabaliam becomes Oroplatz. Right, so the actually existing signatures of these village spaces are at once erased by a future urban imagination that trails in the wake of this project called Oroville. And in one section of the report, Dr. Vishwa stresses how, and I'll read this again, he stresses how, the archives are unclear as to whether Dr. Vishwa is male or female, actually. So Dr. Vishwa stresses how we have tried to explain to the villagers the aim of Oroville. Of course, it was impossible to wean them away from the bad influence of their political leaders, which we'll have to consider carefully, but in a positive way, how best we can integrate them in building the city of tomorrow. These people by no means represent an insurmountable problem. Now, the sociologist grapples here with the potential impediment to progress that villagers may pose to Oroville. And implied, I think, within this notion of progress is the spatial imagination of the city of tomorrow, okay, as a harbinger of development in this underdeveloped regional context. Now, the point is that these claims are made through the very promise of cityness, which is representational and imaginative. It's a representational and imaginative regime that seems here to perform a classic Chicago school city-country opposition, right, in which cityness begins to stand. It becomes emblematic for progress, a movement away from the regressive mire of rurality and into the civility of the city. So some 50 years on from this, when I did my own field work, Oroville was widely known for its architectural vanguardism. And much, in fact, has been written about Orovillian architecture in the form of glossy coffee table books celebrating Oroville's style, its design, landscapes and gardens. And the settlement's websites, it provides information about its architecture and planning. That's just a poor screenshot in the top right there of the website. There's a whole page sort of dedicated to taking you in different directions to learn about the settlement's architecture and planning. And the many, many architects practicing there as well, you can find out all about them. It has an unusually high ratio of architects to civilians in the settlement. And also, another thing worth stressing here is that architectural drawings and CGI, so computer-generated images of the city to come, are kind of displayed everywhere across Oroville's public spaces. And these images are just really to give you some sense of that. Now, what I'm suggesting really is that all those textual reference to Orovillian built space and to its future materialisation as a city, so the coffee table books, the website materials, the CGIs and plans, these all play a constitutive role in the production of a kind of cultural logic regarding the settlement itself. So the point here is that Orovillian urban planning's textual field is not just an epiphenomenon of its concentrated architectural and planning expertise. It's also central to the representational workings of cityness at and as Oroville. So despite the absence of the actually existing density and materiality that many believe to be characteristic of the urban, Oroville then is replete with these plans and CGIs of the future concretisation of buildings and the city to come. These are images that adorn the walls of the town hall, posted on display boards at the visitor centre, so on and so forth, right? They're a conspicuous presence in the landscape. And they conspicuously script the space, producing a pervasive visualisation of a distinctive urban future, cementing the idea that Oroville is indeed a city for the future, a city to come, in the absence of many, as I've said, of those key ingredients of urbanisation. And in this respect, one common yet key visualisation is that of Roger Angers' galaxy plan in the bottom left of your screen now, that the Orovillian architect Anupama Kundu has called a city plan of iconic quality. It's one that's been widely circulated and published, and in fact, precisely because of its wide circulation, not least in and across Oroville itself, has come, as she writes, to symbolically represent the idea of Oroville itself. So the point here is that this plan, this galaxy plan, in some senses is a plan, it's imaginative, but it's very concrete in its effects, in its imaginative effects. Now, there's much more to say about Oroville, but I think my intention here is really just being to demonstrate the ways that representational cityness operates, how it works in the service of power in this context, in this particular case. So for me then, the urban question that Oroville raises is not in fact whether the settlement can be accurately called a city or not. It's instead to ask and explore how cityness is mobilised, right? How it works as an imaginative and representational regime that, in this case, has historically dispossessed rural communities of their land and arguably continues to subtly instantiate forms of neo-coloniality in place. Right, so I want to bring this lecture to a close now and try to draw some of the threads together, actually. So I guess my broad point today has been to advance what I've been referring to as a post-colonial critique of urban studies, to argue that as much as the city is a material and political economic reality, which of course it is, we can also usefully, methodologically think about the city as an imaginative and textual production. So riffing off post-colonial literary theory, like Said's Orient, the city is a textual object. It's a spatial categorization. And to re-emphasize, this is not to shy away from the importance and urgency of getting to grips with the political economy of urban life the world over, including across the global south. However, it is to suggest, as the new cultural geography has done, that one way of understanding the city is as a text. So whatever else the city is, it's also a spatial categorization, a scale of analysis, a taxonomization, and hence theoretical abstraction. And drawing again on the new cultural geographical scholarship that I guess I come from in some senses, the city thought through this kind of intellectual register is, like landscape, which the cultural geographers Stephen Daniels and Dennis Cosgrove described as a way of representing, structuring or symbolising surroundings. Right? So the city, like landscape, is a way of representing, structuring or symbolising surroundings. So to this extent, and like landscape, the city is not just a category of analysis, some pre-existing object with which urban studies scholars engage. We can also, I think of it as a category of practice that has the ability to precipitate its own emergence, and in so doing can obscure other radically different or indeed subtly different spatial formations. And I guess the final point that I want to make today is that this approach, what this approach implies is the ideological nature of urban studies, by which I mean to implicate, after Stuart Hall's reflections and ideology, that the taken as given languages, concepts, categories, imagery of thought and systems of representation whose routine deployment unwittingly stabilises particular forms of power within that formation. Now, Hall's writing on ideology was distinctly Althuserian, insofar as he was concerned with what Louis Althusser referred to as the question of the reproduction of the relations of production. So in other words, how business as usual, or taken as given ways of doing and thinking, are reproduced by the apparatuses in which we operate. And urban studies, of course, cannot do without the city, without the urban, right? It wouldn't be urban studies were it not for these concepts. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood here, because I don't mean to suggest that urban studies is uniquely ideological in the university today. In fact, I would argue, and this is something we talked about in the seminar again this morning, I would argue that all disciplines and sub-disciplines are ideological to an extent. You know, what would cultural geography be without the concept of culture, right? But the work of this lecture then has been to ask first what forms of socio-spatial and planetary difference are excluded by that sub-disciplinary preoccupation with the city and with the urban. And second, however, it's also been to suggest that conceiving of the city as text and being somewhat indifferent to the city methodologically has, I think, the methodological potential to open us to a rich seam of further investigation into the manifold ways that cities and urban imaginations are reproduced representationally, and not least within urban studies itself. So I'll leave it there. I think I've been talking for long enough. Thank you.